At the beginning of this paper, I want to thank Mario Branco for having offered me the possibility of facing the problem of the connection between St. Anthony's sermons and juridical world. At the beginning of the research, I was quite worried, not finding any direct connection between these two words. But several ideas came to me later while reading again the rich work written by the Portuguese friar died in 13 June 1241. At the beginning, just to introduce the collection, St. Anthony wrote two complicated collections of sermons. The main one, about 180 texts for Sundays and feasts. It was written in several moments of Anthony's life. Maybe he collected some materials here in Portugal, even if the discussion is still open. And it is sure that, however, that he finished them in 2030 in Padua. The goal of these sermons is basically to teach practical theology, and it's the one promoted by Peter Cantor, and to teach it to younger friars, the ones called to preach lead. He basically teaches moral theological topics with special care for the pastoral side. Many discussions arose around this collection and its relation with the earlier Franciscanism. Nowadays, it's basically accepted that they are expression of a non-Umbrian Franciscanism, a more learned and ecclesiastical one. Just to remember, the second collection is the Santis one. It's easier and in its construction and in its topic, as it's not finished because of St. Anthony's death. However, passing to juridical concepts. A number of authors tried to approach this topic, especially during the 80s and the early 90s of the 20th century, after the critical edition appeared, and in conjunction with the big conferences organized in Portugal and in Italy for the centuries of birth and death of St. Anthony. But first of all, what's right for him? The friar doesn't give a real definition of right, but uses the word use in a series of contexts that allows us to give a definition of it. Reducing also legal concept to theology, he refers that use is what each one should have or do if the world followed justice. Anthony knows the difference among different kinds of rights. According to him, in fact, the divine law, the one of God, is everything whose transgression is a sin. It's the only one able to guarantee freedom of justice, libertatis justitiae, writes the friar. Natural rights, the second one, comes directly from the gospel, and is, I quote, whatever you do not want done to you, and do not do to the others. It transgressed by all those who violate baptism through sins. Finally, the third one, the human right, is all that concerns the jurisdiction of the social life of man, which includes as a subset the law of Justinian. In this context, the mainly discussed topic was the mutual relationship between law and theology, as it emerges in the sermons. In a series of sermons, in fact, St. Anthony hardly criticized all those clerks involved more in legal proceeding than in searching for the vision of God. Anthony, in fact, refers that, I start quoting, nowadays there is not a marketplace, not a court, whether secular or ecclesiastical, where you will not find monks and religious. They buy and sell again. They build up and pull down, squaring the circle. In their lawsuits, they gather parties, appear before judges, hire lawyers and barristers, and call witnesses. With this, they are prepared to swear oaths for the sake of transitory things, frivolous and vain. Tell me, you faithless religious, was it in prophets, or the Church's Gospels, or in St. Paul's epistles, or in the rules of St. Benedict or St. Augustine, that you find these lawsuits, these wanderings, these disputes about transitory and perishable things, these shouts and protests? Did not rather the Lord say to apostles, monks, and all religions, and not by way of counsel, but by precept, that they should choose the way of perfection? And in another passage, and what shall I say about clerics, and about the prelates of the church. If any bishop or prelate contravenes the decree of Alexander or of Innocent or of some other pope, straightway he is accused, summoned, convicted, and deposed. But if he commits some mortal offense against the gospel of Jesus Christ, which it is his principal responsibility of uphold, no one either accuses him or rebukes him. End of quotation. From this, that's the most famous, and other shorter passages about the human and divine laws in the sermons, emerges an important deep aversion to the resolution of religious life in the observance of external law, with little or no regard for the life of perfection that is promised to religious men. According to St. Anthony, in fact, the human law has to obey to theology, which is the Sacra Doctrina, the exegesis of the scriptures as plenitudo totius scientia. To him, the only real law is the one given by Christ, is justice. Compared to it, all other justices, quotation, are like the cloth of a menstruous woman. End of quotation. It's clear in sermons that the lex humana is at the service of theology as well as philosophy. For theology is the science directly deriving by the words of Christ, who is king and judge of earth and heaven. If it is also clear that Anthony compares each time clerks and not only clerks, reserving it a primary role, it is to notice that he had a general legal culture, maybe coming from the general culture of the time, as we will see later. In the quoted sermon for the second Sunday in Lent, and in the one for the second Sunday after Octave of Epiphany, Anthony remembers the legiste vel decretiste in the right context, as they are the ones called in trials. Moreover, he remembers regulis institutionibus, traditionibus, ad inventionibus, demonstrating also a certain property of the word to refer to different religious rules. Again, the name of the two popes more involved with the law is recalled, Alexander III and Innocent III. He rightly knew that they were the ones writing more decretales than other popes, and compares clerks that refer to them more than to the gospel. The two popes themselves are criticized, as they were both masters in law in Bologna. They didn't come with secular life after election. In Anthony's thought, in fact, the Pope has to be a wise man capable of defending the flock of God from the subtleties of lawyers and philosophers through the use of theology and example. So two popes using law and acting like as lawyers were not good popes for him. In the quoted passage, again, there's the reference to a trial, and Anthony shows a good practical knowledge of how it should work. The same knowledge of such a practical thing, deriving more from everyday life than from studies, arrives in the sermon for the fourth Sunday after Easter, where a judgment is evoked for the sinner who wants to be confessed. Although in general, all participants in the process are remembered: the judge, the prosecutor, the criminal, and 3 witnesses. The same trial is presented in the Miscellanea. This one is the last part of manuscript 720 of the Codice del Tesoro, the most important witness of the sermones, and the one traditionally read, noted, and maybe partly written by the saint himself. Apart the trial, the Miscellanea follows the same topics on law of the sermones, saying that for clerks the scientia secularis is unuseful and is detached from the Bible and from the only basis of Christian perfection, the love of God and of the other. More explicitly than in official sermons, Anthony condemns all religious men going to Bologna to study law, mixing themselves with laymen, even living religious life, and not taking the right care for the only real science, again, theology, and the only real law, the one of God, that have to move all religious souls. In one of those sermons surely attributed to Anthony, the 12, the saint declares that the only source for knowledge is the Holy Scripture, but religious men are not good enough. They are like beasts, the saint tells, to catch it. They are corrupted so that they prefer the law of Justinian and are not able to see heaven. This reference to Justinian arrives also in the sermon for the 9th Sunday after Pentecost. I quote, Domina est theologia, lex Justiniana et lucrativa scientia. The mysteries in theology, the boundment is civil law and knowledge of money-making, says Anthony. Nowadays, the bondmaid is promoted above the mistress, other over civil law over divine law. Our modern prelates, disciples of Antichrist, not Christ, despise their lawful wife and are not ashamed to approach a concubine who, seeing herself pregnant, despises her mistress. In the episcopal court, they shout the law of Justinian, not that of Christ. The weak tells fables, but not as thy law, Lord, which is now abandoned and hated. How wretched is he who pleases himself with the law that judges temporal matters and neglects the law by which himself is judged. End of quotation. These prelates are false ministers in the church, as they sell the church to gain money through their false science. They cannot distinguish appearance from reality, proceed to questions and not certainties. And that's another thing Anthony doesn't approve in the human rights law. As a theologian, he doesn't approve a science proceeding in doubt to doubt and analyzing the formality of things and words. He claims instead the need for every churchman of certainty based on irrefutable certainties given by the knowledge of Holy Scripture. Rather to say, according to him, the method to be followed is given by the effort to find inconsistency of Christian model in the Old Testament reread in the light of the New one. But St. Anthony even didn't refuse juridical tools. What he refuses is the wrong use of them. Ovidio Capitani, in fact, found a reference to the Codex Gratiani in this sermon, the 9th Sunday after Pentecost. Speaking about usury and simony, the preacher refers that, quotation, whoever sells or gives what is spiritual or what is attached to something spiritual by prayer or price, by word or deed, by promising or offering, out of fear or out of earthly or carnal law, he is a simoniac, and he cannot be saved unless he resigns and does true penance. Even the willingness to buy or sell something spiritual makes a man sinner. End of quotation. Although this is at least partly a quotation taken by Gregory the Great, the list seems to copy the headlines of different chapters of the Decretum. The same idea arrives in sermon for the 22nd Sunday after Pentecost, mediated this time by Peter Lombard. So the problem now is, how did the Decretum arrive to Anthony? The use of juridical tools in St. Anthony's sermons, however, is still an unsolved question. The first problem to be addressed coming to this topic was the lack of a direct influence in St. Anthony's thought by his contact with the University of Bologna and all the juridical elaboration there. Maybe the friar's stay in that town was too short. Moreover, I think that Francisco de Gamacaeros and Raul Marcelli's hypothesis of a previous composition of at least part of the sermons is right, so that Italian experiences might have a marginal role in the final work. Secondly, there's a few number of explicit juridical sources in St. Anthony's work. In the entire corpus, in fact, there are 3 quotations recognized by the editors as coming from the Decretum Gratiani, a very little number if compared with those in the Summa Sermonum by Fray Paio de Lisboa. Ovidio Capitani rightly refused these attributions. General and imprecise as they are, they were not uniquely related to the Decretum, refers Capitani, but could have been drawn from Peter Lombard or the Collectio Canonum by Anselm of Lucca. Secondly, the same harsh judgments expressed by the future saint reflect the spirit of the Fourth Lateran Council. Anthony, in fact, reflects both the tension of the Council to a clear separation of the life of the clergy from the laity and some of the central topics of it, such as cultural education for priests, the Constitution 27, and the duty of annual confession and of Holy Communion, Constitution 21. According to Antonio Rigoni, the problem of how to converge aversion to law that prevails on theology with the concerns of legal definition and of accommodation of both practical and disciplinary aspects of the care of soul is a question without an answer. I think instead that it may be approached by the assumption of at least a practical knowledge of the spirit of the Council. In 1215, in fact, one of the main worries expressed in particular by Pope Innocent III was exactly the excessive mingling of laity and clergy also in external and internal features. Constitution 16, for example, laid down outward behavior of ecclesiastic men in order to distinguish them from the way of life and the appearance of laymen. At the very beginning of it, there's the explicit prohibition to take part in officia vel commercia secularia. It is a separation of the clergy from the daily life of the people, motivated by fear that the presence in those places and in those circumstances was dangerous for the honestas clericalis and cause of scandal to the faithful, pointed out Michele Maccarone. Well, I think that Anthony knew this, even if not directly by the text of the Council, at least as it was within the moralizing tendencies of the time inspiring all the sermons. That's why in the Remember Sermon for the second Sunday after the Octave of Epiphany, he condemns both the legiste and the decretiste and the prelates, the wise, or better the learned, and the prudent. It's commonly accepted that Anthony shares the spirit of the Council when speaking about confessions and culture, but a more direct use of the Council arrives in at least 3 sermons. More exact references, however, can be found in the sermon for the 4th Sunday after Pentecost, where a quotation taken from Luke 6:39-40, can the blind lead the blind, etc., is remembered with the same meaning and into the same context of the Constitution 27 of the Council. It's the Constitution about the role of the bishop in clerics learning in function of preaching against heretics. And St. Anthony complains prelates and priests muted by the lack of education which should have been given by their superior. They are unable to fight the wolf, the heresy, and preach for money, act in sin and lust, blinded by their ignorance. The idea of the priest as medicus animarum, one of the newest definitions expressed in the Council Constitution 22, arrives in more than one sermon referring exactly to the role of the priest as confessor and judge of sins. In a moralized context as sermons are, the real meaning of the Constitution seems to get lost as the rule that the medical doctor of the body must call the doctor of souls at the bedside of a dying person and ensure him the opportunity of last compassion is not expressed. Anthony, however, remembers it by recalling the 2 words speaking about the resurrected Lazarus. As Christ healed Lazarus from physical death, the confessor, as doctor of souls, has to recover the sinner from spiritual death, spiritually licking up his wounds, the sins, and healing them. Lastly, the already mentioned sermon for the 9th Sunday after Pentecost remembered the Constitution 8 of the Council, the one about inquisitions. This research is just at its beginning, and finding references to the 4th Council in St. Anthony's sermons is not as easy as it may seem. For Anthony doesn't quote exactly the words of Constitution, but just remember the same ideas or the same evangelical quotations. Another way of proceeding, in fact, may be a systematical comparison of the way scriptural quotations are used in Constitution and in sermons, to see if they match. It's a long work, only suggested by Michele Maccarone and not followed by any other scholar. In conclusion, St. Anthony had a certain degree of knowledge of the juridical world and of its tools. He refuses it when he sees that churchmen act like laymen, without keeping the right distance from the secular world and losing the real science that should characterize people devoted to Christ, the rich. But Anthony lived in the way coming out from the 4th Lateran Council, and what he regrets seem to echo exactly Innocent III complaints. We know that he didn't use his decretales, but he uses his sermons. Moreover, I think that we have to remember that Anthony was part of the deputy going to Gregory IX to discuss how to use St. Francis' Testament and the rule. So he had to have some juridical knowledge to discuss with the Pope and his experts this topic. Moreover, it's quite sure he didn't study with any professor of law in his youth. Francisco da Gama Cairo proposed the hypothesis that during his stay in the Cathedral School of Lisbon, Saint Anthony might have been a disciple of the famous canonist Mendo Gonçalves, related of the famous master Silvestre Godinho, or of Vicente Hispano. Martin de Albuquerque demonstrated that this last was impossible, for St. Anthony being the cathedral school about 10 years before Vicente's arrival. Albuquerque himself, however, accepts the evidence that the preacher had some knowledge of the law, which allowed him to use certain legal topoi, like the very common definition of justice. If the problem of what books Anthony could have read to take his sources, not only for juridical passages, but also for philosophical and theological ones, we should not underestimate the importance of the experience of this biography, a life in a world from which he always tried to escape. St. Anthony's life itself, in fact, could be the cause of its intellectual proximity to the spirit of the Council, in its refusal of the lifestyle held on by Augustinian canons. He judged too many in secular life, in his contemptus mundi, and his searching for a sexual life. In conclusion, what emerges from this study is a denial of the same tools the preacher used as living in a society, using them for daily life. Was it a choice to adapt his language to the one of his audience, as we might suppose reading the passages of judgment, or an attempt to guide it, explaining the spirit of the council and of canon law to lay? The question, again, has no answer yet. Thanks.
So after I've seen law as a mediation process and then the application of that law firsthand, now we have a completely different view of the law from the eyes of someone that seems to not have a pretty good appreciation of all of this legal environment. So if someone wants to begin the debate.
You referred to Anthony's participation in the question of breaking the line, question of will. I just wonder whether in the sermons there is anywhere any recognition of the relevance, possible relevance of forensic technique, of lawyers' ability to present a case, argue to theological or spiritual the world of sermons, because in principle it might be thought that the question of technique is one which straddles the two disciplines. Is there in fact any?
No, the problem of St. Anthony's sermons is that they were conceived to be a theological tool. So it doesn't care really about the technique, the oral technique. And so he doesn't approach this topic either for theological topics, so it's quite impossible to find it for lawyers. And also because in that period they were trying to specialize, almost in Paris, the way of preaching, to detach it from the Ars Constitutionale, the one still used by St. Francis. So he doesn't really approach it, and he writes not as a preacher, he writes as a theologian. There is not a construction, for example, of a sermon like the modern sermon is, but just as a theological treatise. So it doesn't really touch this topic. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for St. Anthony.
I'm also curious to ask because having read some of Innocent III's rules, we come across so many of these same expressions, the worry about the health of the soul and what we should address first, and all these images about, and of course we know Innocent III is probably not a canonist but a theologian first and foremost. And so it's interesting that he uses the fourth Lateran so much, and it would be very interesting to do. I was wondering how But with the others, he comes in a bad time for someone who doesn't like folks to be lawyers. He was in the wrong moment. But it's quite interesting that although denying it, he's using it. And I think such a cruise where he spent quite a few years would have had more than the tools that he needed to get this preparation. In Lisbon, I think we do not know how for these early years. I think they may be very well all speculations. As far as we know from the community in Lisbon, they close everything up and everything up there.
They have a school there.
Yes, they have a school. When we get to Santa Cruz de Coimbra, the display we have, although no manuscripts, no legal manuscripts, the display we have indirectly is that yes, they were very much into legal matters, and so was the cathedral see, and so were the alphas and the cistercians, which we're going to talk about. So he would have come across it quite extensively. As far as we know, he spent, I don't even know how many years he spent in the crew. I think 2 or 3. Right. And we counted even for the legal ambience he found.
Yeah. For spending his life in Santa Cruz standing. So, a geographer, perfectionist, there's learning. So, yeah. I just know that more scholar concentrated their attention on Lisbon for this topic than on Santa Cruz. So it's good to
Sorry, can you speak a little bit louder?
yeah, okay. I was just saying that basically all historians touching the topic of juridical word in St. Anthony were concentrated on this Lisbon part of life. So the suggestion of Maria João is quite interesting for me. I'm not so used to Portuguese topics, okay? But for no one has tried to make some proposals for Santa Cruz time, even if we know that he was spending his 3 years, maybe just starting in Santa Cruz. He perfected his learning there.
I have a quick question. One, there is probably very evident, in another one, probably very impossible to answer and very dumb for me to prove. But anyways, the first thing is this conception of the law that St. Anthony seems to have. Is it central in his thought, in his thinking? Since you know, like all of its production, this topic specific, it's central, or it's just kind of indoctrination for the phrase that he's trying to teach. And secondly, if I answer correctly, is against the application of the law or those involved in its application. Has he has something against the notion of law itself? Does it show? Because from what you presented us, he has a problem with the application of the engagement of the friars in it.
Not friars, but just prelates and all religious men. But the problem of the law doesn't arrive so often in the sermons, for it's part of the bigger problem of this mingling of clerks and lay. That's central in his thought. So law is part of those lucrative scienze, and so it expresses himself against philosophers, for example, in the same way. For philosophy is something that clerks shouldn't touch, for they have theology of their basis. And he has something against the process of the law, of human law. For he says exactly that law proceeds just touching the superficial aspects of things and proceed through that. And he says that clerks, prelates cannot proceed in this way, for they have to touch the deepest things, the deepest side of things, and they have to give certainties, to live in certainties, and the certainties come from the Holy Scripture. He hasn't really a problem with the law in itself. I mean, he uses it in a certain way. He has this problem with prelates, bishops, and religious that, for example, are living their religious life to attend this, or that arrive in front of the Papal Court, for example, and do not discuss as theologians, but as lawyers. So he has a problem with this, not with the law in itself. I mean, he uses the word justitia and so on, but tries always to put attention, not to give too much care about what arrives from human law, for example, just not to appear one of those people too much involved in human law.
Going up to Santa Cruz again, going back to Santa Cruz. There is a reason, I think some reason, I believe that Melendus, in Portuguese term, originated there, when he went to Curia in Rome and finished up with Bishop of Osma. And Flash, I think, he certainly was a peninsula, which was briefly flourishing place in the very beginning of the 30th century. But it's not central to what you've been talking about. But it was the case of Melendus, who was quite a heavyweight.
And as far as we know, there also the connections between Santa Cruz de Coimbra and the Braga Sea were quite close in terms of circulation of men. And of course, Laurentius was in Orense with close connections to Braga. Vincentius came apparently also, or could have come from Coimbra. So not at a later stage when Vincentius was already back in Lisbon as a dean, but in his previous life when he was also doing that track, it's very possible that they all had superimpositions and that they all met at a certain point. I think Santa Cruz de Coimbra is a serious place to learn the law, and amongst other things, the notaries and everything. Even this morning we were talking about formularies and how that is something which has to be studied in conjunction. So I think, yes, that's all together and it's very helpful. And, so that provides a basis. And it shows that the Antonians of Padova need to meet the Anthony of Portugal, because that's where his roots come from. And his vocation later in life is probably something that justifies his end.
The Mendo's work are published?
Melendus glosses are published extensively.
Yes, there are glosses. The place to look is Flash.
Yes, the Sacerdotium und Regnum.